If you're a long-time subscriber, you probably remember the 944 that I owned, made a bunch of mediocre videos with, and subsequently sold. If you're not a long-time subscriber, then I owned a 1983 Porsche 944, made a bunch of mediocre videos with it, and subsequently sold it. And now you're up to speed. Now it's time for me to give you an update on what happened to that car after I sold it, because here it is, some 2.5 years after I sold it. This is my first real enthusiast car. I sort of cut my teeth on it. But like the eccentric millionaire that I'm not, I got bored of it. This car just wasn't interesting enough to keep me, well, interested. Nowadays it takes something really interesting to keep me entertained for long periods of time. Why else would I have a Wigo and a Trabant simultaneously? Really, it just has to be really terrible or really strange. And this car is neither one of those things. But anyway, I got bored of it. I listed it for sale, and because IR YouTuber, I made a big hullabaloo about the sale in video form, and then I sold this car, onto its next owner. But Robert, I hear you say, how art thou driving thou Porsche that thou hast sold? I shouldn't try to do the old English thing. How are you driving this car? You sold it. It's not yours anymore. Well, I'll tell you how, because the person I sold it to is my mother. Yes, my mother bought my 944. She had a renewed interest in 944s ever since I got mine. No coincidence there. She even bought her own 944 at one point, but that thing was a plasti-dip turd, which, if that wasn't bad enough, it also had a 3-speed automatic in a 944. And that transmission is roughly the transmission equivalent of first-generation voice dictation. She had that car for something like a year before doing the only logical thing, which was to sell it to a trucker that had plans to manual swap it, and I guess he could put up with all the other problems it had, like the disgusting paint that was underneath all of that plasti-dip. But anyway, obviously, since this car that she had was a pile of garbage, it did not satisfy that 944 itch, so when I listed mine for sale, she nabbed it. Now, I was reluctant to sell the car to her at first, but the only other interested buyer I had was a 15-year-old boy who was trying very hard to convince his parents to let him buy a 944 as his first car. So I took the easy way out and sold it to my mother. This spoiler's really hot. Shouldn't lean on it. So what's happened with this car since I sold it on to her? Well, almost nothing. She doesn't drive it very much. In fact, if you believe the odometer, she's put exactly 0 miles on it since she bought it. But the odometer didn't work, so, you know, that's explainable. Speaking of the odometer, that's one of the reasons the car is here with me. She left it with me so I could take it into St. Louis to get various things fixed at a shop that I'll call the Porsche shop. One of the things that she wanted fixed was the odometer. These cars have a known fault that if you reset the odometer while the car is moving, it breaks it. For the entire time I owned this car, it had 52,783 miles. Now, after I took it to the Porsche shop, the odometer works fine, which is great, but I just don't think that's any fun at all. It's more fun to just laugh at your odometer that isn't working and say, ha, those Germans. Another thing they fixed at the Porsche shop was the e-brake. Now, this was easy to fix, but I never did it because I found the e-brake amusing. Because the e-brake on a 944, if you're not familiar, is here on the driver's side door sill instead of being on the center console like most other cars. Now, this is a problem because so many people had sat on this thing over the years that it could be disengaged by just barely touching it. Now, I found this amusing. My mother, however, wanted it fixed, so now I can put all my pressure on it and it won't go down, and it works like a proper e-brake. Once again, no fun at all. But the main reason she took the car in for service was for the timing belts, because I mistakenly thought that the timing belts needed to be replaced every 2 years or so if the car had been left sitting. What needed to be done was the timing belts needed to be inspected every 2 years or so, so that's exactly what I had the mechanic do. Shortly after I dropped the car off at the Porsche shop, the mechanic called me and gave me some rather alarming news, but for what he said to have any meaning, I first need to give you a little bit of a backstory about this car. For the entire time I owned this car, the engine ran a bit rough. Revving it out felt like activating an industrial vibrator, and it made the exhaust sound like a can full of bolts. What was really annoying is this engine had a couple of resonance frequency zones to avoid. There were a couple of spots in the rev range, let's say 2400 and 3800 RPMs, I don't really remember, that would turn the exhaust into large mechanical rattlesnake mode. Now this was so annoying that it actually affected my driving habits. So I would shift either too early or too late to avoid putting the engine in those resonance frequency zones because the exhaust rattle was so obnoxious. Early on, I had a theory as to what could be causing these engine roughness issues, because this is an engine with balance shafts in it. It has two balance shafts, each driven with their own timing belt. So it only made sense to me that one or both of the balance shafts was off timing some amount, which would perfectly explain not only the engine roughness, but why there are resonance frequency issues at all. Several years ago, I took this car in to have the timing belts replaced at a shop that I'll call the Germaniacs. While the car was in there, I asked the mechanic at the Germaniacs shop to have a look at the timing on the balance shafts while he was in there mucking around with the timing belt. I thought for sure that the balance shaft timing would be off and that would be the cause of my engine running suboptimally. Much to my disappointment, after the timing belt job was done, the mechanic called me and said, "Your balance shafts were only off by one tooth, which wouldn't be enough to cause your rattling issue." And sure enough, when I got the car back and drove it after the timing belt had been replaced and the balance shafts had been inspected, it still ran rough. Later on, continually annoyed by having no fly zones in my engine's rev range, I took the car to another mechanic, who I'll call Jim, to see if he could diagnose one of the symptoms of the problem rather than the cause, which was to try to quiet down some of the rattling in the exhaust. So he probed around a little bit and he said, "It might be the catalytic converter that's rattling, but I really don't know for sure. Would you like to replace it?" And I said, "Sure, try anything." So he replaced the catalytic converter, and the original is actually still in the back here. This is the original cat off the car. It's hot, it's been sitting in the sun. So he replaced the cat with a new one, and it only helped a little bit. It didn't completely eliminate the rattle, it just reduced it. After the cat replacement failed to fix really anything, I just sort of gave up. I just accepted that my 944's engine isn't going to be as smooth as other 944 engines, and I'm probably never going to know why. This brings me back to the rather alarming news the mechanic at the Porsche shop gave me about what is now my mother's car. Because I asked him to inspect the timing belts for wear. He said the timing belts were fine, but the balance shafts were way off the timing mark. This means the mechanic that replaced my timing belt at Germaniacs either lied to me or had no idea what he was doing, and my initial theory as to the cause of the roughness in the engine was completely correct. Another thing to note is when the mechanic at the Porsche shop fixed the balance shaft timing, he noted that the balance shaft pulleys were covered in plier marks. So not only was the mechanic at Germaniacs ill-equipped with knowledge, he was ill-equipped with tools as well. So what did I learn from this story? Well, I either need to find a mechanic I can trust, which can be difficult and expensive, although I found one for this car, or I need to do the work myself on a car that is mine. Because even if I get something wrong, even if I mess something up, not only am I the only idiot to blame, but I probably learned something in the process. So, do I regret selling this car? Well, before the engine was all smoothed out and it was running like a German pencil sharpener, no. But now that the engine is sorted, just a little bit. I'm more just angry at the Germaniac for not fixing the problem with the timing when I requested it some 3 years ago. I can only imagine how much my ownership experience with the car would have changed had the engine been running properly. But whatever, I have to let bygones be bygones. But anyway, this car now is in pretty good shape. Everything works, and I don't think I'd hesitate to daily drive it. The air conditioning works, the odometer works, e-brake works, the engine works. All but one of those things didn't work before when I owned the car. The only thing that is possibly worrisome is the clutch, because the grab point is way up on the clutch pedal, and from the factories these things had rubber-centered clutch discs instead of the normal spring-dampened clutch arrangement. This car is 35 years old now, and these things have perished long before this sort of time passage, so I'm pretty sure the rubber in the middle of this clutch disc is gone, and it certainly feels like it. There's a lot of play, slack in the drive line that I can do that with. And the worst part is the clutch is a 16-hour job, because the engine's up there, The transmission's back there, and they're connected by a rigid torque tube, and the clutch is up there. So you gotta move a lot of that out of the way to replace the clutch, and that's going to take a while. And that's probably why my mother is not going to worry about the clutch until it, I don't know, just slips entirely. So there's that. But otherwise, the car is in the best shape of its life. One of my favorite things about the sounds that this car makes, it doesn't sound particularly good or anything like that, but you can hear each individual fuel injector firing when you're accelerating. I just love that. You can't hear any intake noise or anything like that, but you can hear the fuel being fired out. Now that this car is in the best shape I've ever seen it, it's time for me to give it back to my mother so she can continue to not drive it and let cats walk all over it. I'm not sure if this story was worth telling or if this video is worth making, but I'm sure there was at least one person out there that wondered what happened to my 944 and wondered why it was in the background of the last video. So if you are part of that at least one person large crowd, here's your answer. See you in 2 weeks.